The project I'm going to talk to you today is about the question whether cross-language interference in bilingual speakers is domain-specific. And we're actually going to ask that in two ways, whether it's domain-specific within language domains and whether it's domain-specific more broadly within language and cognition. This is a joint project with Tamar, Rana, Yassin, Sehrab, Awawdy, and Khateb. So I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to tell you about a study we ran where we have a measure of lexical interference from L1 to L2. We have a measure of syntactic interference from L1 to L2. And then we want to ask whether people's ability to overcome interference from their native language while processing their second language is correlated across these two domains of language. And then we further want to ask whether it's predictable by their overall proficiency in the L2 and also by their ability to overcome interference more generally in other cognitive domains. So L1 interference is a major source of difficulty for L2 learners. And there is some thoughts in the research literature recently that one of the kind of signatures of growing proficiency in the second language is a better ability to overcome this interference that's coming from a person's first language. And also there's this whole huge debate that actually right now there's a workshop going on in New York City debating the question of whether bilingual peoples or bilingual individuals kind of lifelong experiencing and managing and controlling their two languages might be linked to advantages overall in kind of the control functions within the cognitive system. And there is some evidence linking these two together, though, as I said, the debate is very hot right now. And within kind of the wider control of executive functions, we're going to focus specifically on this construct of inhibition, which is kind of the ability to focus your attention on one thing and not be distracted by other irrelevant information, which in fact is exactly what second language processing entails, because you need to not be influenced by whatever structures or words become activated in your L1, but rather kind of stay within the processing of the L2. Okay, so our questions were, first of all, because our study population were native Arabic speakers processing in Hebrew, and this links directly to what Zohar was just saying, we wanted to investigate more closely the kind of extent of interference from an L1 into an L2 when the two languages do not share an orthography, because most of research in this domain has been done on Spanish-English, Dutch-English, German-Dutch, German-French, Spanish, French bilingual. So all these languages that share a common orthography. And we wanted to ask, does this look similar when the two languages use different orthographies? The second question, as I said, was whether the ability of individuals or individual differences in the ability to overcome interference from L1 are generalized across language domains. So if I have a better, if I'm better at overcoming interference within lexical processing, will I also be better when I'm looking at syntax? And finally, whether the susceptibility of different individuals to interference from L1 is reduced with higher L2 proficiency and or with enhanced executive function. So these are kind of independent predictors that we wanted to see how well they might help us understand the variability among learners. Okay, so our study population were native Arabic undergraduates here at the University of Haifa. They had been studying Hebrew as a second language from third grade, and they were, at the time of the study, they were immersed in higher education in Hebrew. They were fairly highly proficient as far as bilingual populations go, but they were not balanced. So they all rated Arabic as their strongest, stronger language. And we also, for each task, we had a group of native Hebrew-speaking controls, just to see that whatever performance we can see for the Arabic speakers in the L2 is not just a result of the task in Hebrew, but really is showing us interference from the L1. Okay, so the lexical task was a cross-model semantic judgment task. So participants would hear one word in Hebrew, would see a second word on the computer screen, and had to judge whether the two words were related in meaning or not. And in order to create interference, we used words which sound the same in Hebrew and in Arabic, but which have different meanings. So on such a trial, the person would hear the word lechem, which means bread in Hebrew, and would see the word ikliz on the screen, which means butcher shop. Now in Hebrew, these two are not related. But lachem in Arabic means meat. So if when you hear the word lechem in Hebrew, the meaning in Arabic becomes activated, then you have interference here, because the information from Arabic would lead you to want to say, yes, these two words are related. And of course we had controls to compare performance. Okay. And we had false cognates, and we had other words, and we controlled everything for frequency and length and whatever you can think of, I hope. Okay, so these are the results for the reaction times. In blue you see the native Arabic speakers, and in orange you see the native Hebrew speakers. And what I'm plotting is the difference between the critical condition and the control condition. So the condition where you have irrelevant information activated from Arabic, and the control condition where you do not. And what we see is significant lexical interference for the Arabic speakers. So the fact that these words in Hebrew have alternative meanings in Arabic influenced their performance. They were slower when they said, no, the two words in Hebrew are not related, and they were also less accurate. So on a larger number of trials, they said, yes, lechem, bread, and butcher shop, for example, are related. Whereas in Hebrew, this percent was very low. Okay, and this, we interpret this as the activation of Arabic coming through while they're doing the task in Hebrew. Okay, so this was the first demonstration that we can see significant interference between these two languages. The second level of language processing that we wanted to look at was the level of syntax. And what we did here, which is nice because Hebrew and Arabic are similar in many ways, we identified syntactic structures which are the same across the two languages. So for example, adjectives for animate nouns take on number agreement, both in Hebrew and in Arabic. So if you're talking about reliable people, the adjective reliable has to be inflected for plural, okay? And when it's inflected for plural, then the resulting sentence is grammatical, both in Hebrew and in Arabic. And when it's not inflected for number, it's ungrammatical in both languages. Okay, so we have this is sort of our control condition, because here we don't expect any interference from Arabic, because the structure works in exactly the same way across the two languages. However, you can also identify syntactic structures where this is not the case. So in Hebrew, inanimate nouns, again, require number agreement of the adjective, but in Arabic they do not. Okay, so if you have an inanimate noun, in Hebrew, plural inanimate noun, in Hebrew you were expecting the adjective to be plural too, but in Arabic, not. In Arabic the adjective needs to be in the singular form. So what you can see here, that the structure that's grammatical in Hebrew is ungrammatical in Arabic, but the structure that's ungrammatical in Hebrew is grammatical in Arabic. So if you're a native Arabic speaker and you're judging, and I'll tell you how the task works, but if you're dealing with these sentences in Hebrew, you might come across a grammatical sentence in Hebrew where the Arabic is signaling, wait, there's something wrong here, and the opposite. There would be an ungrammatical sentence in Arabic, whereas in Hebrew, whereas in Arabic, it would be fine. Okay? And the way the task worked was a self-paced reading task, so people read sentences on the screen, and they timed the appearance of each word in the sentence according to their speed of reading. And we looked at the reading times, both at the point in the sentence where it became obvious that there was a grammatical mistake, also on the word after, because many times these effects in reading time are not apparent on the critical word, but what's called spillover effects. On the next word, you're kind of stuck still figuring out what happened a moment ago, and also at the end of the sentence. And after the sentence were done, we also asked them, was the sentence grammatical? Was there an error there, or was it okay? And we had, the structure I demonstrated with was just one of 5 different structures of each type that we used. Okay. So again, what we're seeing here are the grammaticality effects. So right now I'm looking at the reading times on the word after the critical word in the sentence, and I'm asking how much longer do people stay on that word for ungrammatical sentences as opposed to grammatical sentences. So this is like detecting that there was something wrong with the sentence. And on the right, you see the similar structures, okay? And you see that everybody slows down a little bit when there's an ungrammatical sentence, But the degree of slowdown is very similar for the native Arabic speakers and for the native Hebrew speakers. As opposed to that, when we look at the different sentences, so different structures where we could assume that there is interference coming through from the Arabic, we see that indeed the native Arabic speakers slow down to a much greater degree after they had encountered an ungrammatical sentence in Hebrew. Okay, and we think this is because this structure is ungrammatical in Hebrew, but there's kind of a conflict coming up because in Arabic, a similar structure would be fine. The other measure we looked at is at the judgments at the end of the sentence, and we asked how well can our participants distinguish between grammatical and ungrammatical sentence. How accurate are they in their judgments? And to this end, we calculated their D prime, so their sensitivity to the distinction between grammatical and ungrammatical sentences. And you can see that again, for the similar sentences, the native Arabic speakers and the native Hebrew speakers are performing very similarly. But for the different structure sentences, the native Arabic speakers are having a much harder time distinguishing these structures in Hebrew, whether they're grammatical or ungrammatical. And we again interpret this as the interference coming through from their own. Okay, so first of all, I think we've established fairly clearly that even if you are speaking, reading, using two languages with different orthographies, there's still significant interference coming through from the L1 in fairly advanced L2 learners. So these are people taking university classes in Hebrew. You know, they're very advanced L2 learners. Okay, but still we can see these interference, and we can see it both in lexical processing and in grammar. The second question is, do they work together? So if you're good at overcoming interference, is this kind of a generalized skill, and you can do this well both in lexicon and in grammar? Or are these kind of modality unique abilities that might develop independently in the two domains? And what we found was that they were correlated, but not very strongly so. Okay, so there is what you see on the x-axis is a measure of the syntactic interference, and then the y-axis the lexical interference. Okay, so it's not that they're completely unrelated, but it's not that we can really think of this as just one single skill that is put into play both for lexicon and for grammar. Okay, so there is some sharing across linguistic domains, but we also believe that there's some within system-specific learning of how this operates within the lexicon and how interference or overcoming interference is realized within the syntactic system. And finally, our question was, how does this relate to kind of external predictors? So if is it the case that the more proficient you are overall in your L2, you will also become better at overcoming interference from the L1? Is that kind of one signature of proficiency? And again, how does this align with executive functions more generally? If you are a good inhibitor overall, are you also a good inhibitor of interference within this kind of dual language situation? Okay, and we had measures for Hebrew proficiency, so we had a vocabulary measure, we have kind of a language entrance university exam, we had self-ratings in Hebrew. And for inhibition, we had two non-linguistic tasks. We had a Stroop task and a kind of Simon spatial Stroop. It has different names, but in both cases, these tasks generate a measure of how distracted you are by irrelevant information. And this is what we used as predictors in our models. Okay, so these are the models predicting susceptibility to lexical interference. And as you can see, they're not predicting very much at all. So best case, we're predicting 10% of the variance, and neither of the models is significant. So this means that people's ability, or learners' ability to kind of not be misled by the irrelevant meaning of words in Arabic, in this sample was not found to be related either to their overall proficiency in Hebrew or to their inhibitory abilities overall. Neither in reaction timing or in accuracy. Okay, completely. That's not what this story was about. We still don't know what it is about, but it's not about this. When we look at the syntax, we actually find two different patterns. When we're looking at the spillover effect, so the reading times, again, we have a not very impressive model. It's not significant. But when we look at the sensitivity measure, so kind of the more offline judgment at the end of the sentence and the ability to distinguish between grammatical and ungrammatical structures, here we have fairly robust prediction. And what we see is that people who are more proficient in Hebrew generally are more sensitive to the difference between grammatical and ungrammatical structures. And we also see an independent and significant contribution of inhibitory abilities to this specific skill. Okay, so of the 4 measures we had for kind of susceptibility to interference, this is the only one where we find significant prediction from proficiency and from inhibition. So it's kind of a little bit, not really, maybe we need another study. Okay, because at this point we see that one of our measures out of 4 for cross-language interference was related to these external factors, but the other 3 were not. Okay, so one of the things that we're kind of speculating about is it might be that the syntactic task actually required more, it was a more difficult task, it tapped a higher level of proficiency, and that might be why we're seeing kind of a better ability to predict differences in that task. And another thing is that what we're considering is it might be the type of the measure that we're using. So the steep prime sensitivity measure is qualitatively different than our other measures of interference, which are differences between a condition with interference and a condition without, and it's kind of a, I wouldn't call it meta-linguistic, but it's a more removed measure, and it might be a more stable indication of ability than these kind of RT or accuracy difference scores, and we know that difference scores are difficult to work with always, so we're thinking maybe that's part of the story here. So to conclude, first of all, we found robust, significant interference from L1 to L2 in speakers of languages that do not share in orthography. And we found that the ability of learners to overcome L1 interference is generalized to a certain extent. So there was relation across linguistic domains, and there was some partial prediction from L2 proficiency overall and from domain general interference management, but it certainly is not the whole story, because the amount that these things work together was not very strong in either case. Thank you. Difficult is it for them to process a structure that's ungrammatical in Hebrew, and we're comparing that in the case where it's also ungrammatical in Arabic.
Well, did you have situations like that? See, did you have a situation where it was ungrammatical in both languages?
Yeah, this is the control. This is the similar structure. Okay, here it's yes, the cross participants, each sentence appeared once grammatically and once not grammatically.
And were responses to when they were similar, they were coming through? Was it faster?
So there was a
similar.
Well, Arabic speakers were always slower because it's their L2. So when you compare L2 processing to L1 processing, there was always a group effect, a main effective group. But when you process an ungrammatical sentence, even if it's in your L1, there is some slowing. So there's kind of a signature of encountering something ungrammatical. And the point is that when in these structures that were similar, the degree of having a problem with the ungrammatical structure was the same for the two groups. But in these types of sentences, yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, so here, if you look on the right, both groups are, what you see here is their reading time difference between a grammatical and an ungrammatical structure. Okay, so they're all slowed down. There's always an effect of grammaticality, but it's much bigger when there's an incongruence between the Arabic and the Hebrew for the native Arabic speakers.
Was it in the native, was it symmetric? That's what I'm trying to ask. So when it's different, okay, it can be correct in Hebrew or incorrect in Hebrew.
Right. We always did the subtraction from the ungrammatical to the grammatical.
No, I understand, but in the different conditions, there are two conditions. There are the condition where they have to say yes and they have to say no.
Right.
Right? And the question is, was it symmetric? Was it the same effect for both of them?
But we can only look at them in comparison to each other. Because if it's ungrammatical, that's when you're slow down. I can show you the fuller data later. Yeah.
Native Hebrew speaker read sentences
Only
only in Hebrew.
me.
Okay, that's sort of Breznitz.
Yes, these are the control.
And native Arabic speaker read sentences which are grammatical and ungrammatical, both in Arabic and in Hebrew.
Only Hebrew. The entire task was all about
That's
Hebrew.
right.
I just showed you the Arabic so you would see where the interference is coming from.
That's my question.
Only Hebrew.
How does such effect compare to other effects which are simply used to second language processing?
Well, what I told Zora is that there was an overall effect. So the Arabic speakers were slower and they were less accurate. But what you can see is that the degree to which they're finding difficulty with ungrammatical sentences is different in these two conditions. So if it's a structure that's similar in Arabic, sure, they're slowed down a little bit, but they're not slowed down more than the native Hebrew speakers are. But in the different condition, when they're confronted with a sentence that's ungrammatical in Hebrew, but would be fine in Arabic, then they're slowed down much more. It's much more difficult to process because we think, our interpretation is that you have conflicting information coming from Arabic. Okay, and even if you look at the accuracy, with the similar structures, they were slightly less accurate because it's their second language. But with the different structures, they were much less accurate. It was much more difficult for them to distinguish between a grammatical and an ungrammatical sentence in Hebrew when the corresponding structure in Arabic was different. It's a little bit complicated. Yeah. We know this from transfer more generally, so we know that learning structures that are similar to your native language is generally easy. For these specific ones, but it's again another way of saying that there's interference, right? Because if it's more difficult to learn, right. Yeah, but there is, I didn't go into this now, but you know there's endless evidence showing that it's not that when you're processing your L2, your L1 is sitting quietly in the back. So we think a lot of, it could be that they're learned more, later, but that again is because of the L1 influence. I think it's different perspectives saying something